I'm Lisa Samson. I'm the Managing Principal of StrategyCorp's Ottawa office. And I'm joined today by Andrew Steele, Garry Keller, and Kim Wright. I'm just going to briefly introduce each one of them. Andrew is a Liberal and served as Senior Advisor to the Premier of Ontario, as well as Chief of Staff in several ministries. He has held several campaign roles for the Liberal Party of Canada and the Ontario Liberal Party, and is a frequent media pundit. He is a Vice President at StrategyCorp. Welcome, Andrew. Garry Keller, maybe just give us a wave. Garry has served in several key leadership roles in Canadian politics, including as Chief of Staff to Canada's Foreign Minister, Chief of Staff to the Leader of the Opposition, Rona Ambrose, and Chief Parliamentary Advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He also served as acting Chief of Staff to the UCP, the United Conservative Party Caucus, back in 2017. And Kim Wright is head of Wright Strategies. She is a municipal affairs expert, but her expertise is not limited to one level of government. She has been involved in politics at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels since 1990, and is a frequent media commentator on political issues for the NDP. Most recently, she was CPAC's panelist last night, and I've already asked Kim whether or not she got any sleep, and the answer is yes, but not a lot.
Lots of coffee.
Coffee, this is the caffeinated version. So we're just going to start with the first initial round of questions. Andrew, I'm going to start with you. Lisa called this election a $600 million cabinet shuffle. If the Liberals had a do-over, would they still have called it?
Yeah, I think so. I think the thinking, maybe I'll step back. So minority governments eventually fall. This is about a typical lifetime, the last government. And I think, speaking candidly, the government had a relatively narrow window where it could call an election. And I've always been pretty uncomfortable. I'm speaking here just as a citizen, not even as a Liberal, that the government had spent $360 billion, I think it was, on COVID and didn't have a mandate for it. There was no reason to do it. So going to the polls, I think you can make an argument for why they went. I think they also thought they could get a majority. I think that was a set of thinking. Having gone, I think they've now secured a win, right? Like a win is a win is a win. The Conservatives will have their challenges post-election, which will make it harder for them to demand an election early on. The NDP will have financial challenges because they're going to have issues of how do we finance this. Spend a lot of money, and there'll be fundraising. So I don't think anybody's going to be looking for an election really quickly. And so the opportunity now is for another round of stability. Essentially, they had that stability beforehand, but now they get at least another year of pretty solid stability. I think looking back on it, if the government had everything they could do over again, they wouldn't have given we a contract, and they probably would have gone last summer and probably would have had, frankly, a better result. That option was taken away by the WE scandal, and as a result, they are where they are today. I'll put it that way.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Garry, Aaron O'Toole seemed to pull out all the stops in pulling the Conservative Party to the center of the political spectrum, but it yielded basically the same result as 2019. How do you reconcile the median Conservative voter with the median Canadian voter? And is there anything that we need to read into this election result?
Yeah, good question, Lisa. And this was obviously going to be, this result is going to create a lot of soul searching within the Conservative Party, the Conservative movement. There was a lot of unhappiness amongst some of the Conservative base within the party, Conservative activists, especially in Western Canada. The adoption of some form of carbon pricing was seen by some as a bit of a betrayal to Conservative principles, but it was part of the grand bargain that Aaron O'Toole had laid out at the party convention back in April in the lead up to the election, knew that there was going to be an election at some point, basically that in order to win an election, there had to be a trade-off. You had to maybe give up 10 to 15% of Conservative vote share in ridings in Western Canada where they won massive majorities but are unhelpful, and to try to adopt a little bit more of the Liberal strategy of trying to be more efficient with your vote in Central Canada. So the adoption of some centrist measures in the platform, carbon pricing was obviously the biggest signal for the party, was a clear attempt to do that. Aaron O'Toole is going to have a very difficult time now There are a number of people both in the Conservative caucus and the Conservative movement who, of course, don't like losing, but if they were to lose, they would rather lose in a principled fashion and sticking to their principles rather than having moved to the center and lost. So I think, Mr. O'Toole last night in his concession speech was actually a very aggressive concession speech because he was trying to cement his leadership on his party. As you recall, back in 2019, Andrew Scheer didn't do that right away. And on election night, he had more knives in his back than Julius Caesar did. And so I think that was a very clear attempt to do that. And I think the Conservative Party doesn't quite know how to reconcile that Conservative voter with Conservative principles. And the PPC vote last night, and we'll get more into the vote shares, certainly will have an impact on how they approach it. But it's going to be a challenging time for Mr. O'Toole, I think, going ahead.
Leadership raised in the first round here. I'm sure we're going to get into it. Kim, the NDP increased its share of the popular vote by a little bit last night, but as of today has only won one more seat. Now, I know that there are lots of mail-in ballots that have yet to be counted, but what more could or should the NDP do to keep voters in the orange tent as opposed to migrating over to the red?
So it's actually quite interesting. And as I've been looking through the entrails this morning of various ridings and watching different vote shares in ridings that we haven't traditionally been competitive in, being incredibly competitive in. There were some heartbreaking, moments of, not recapturing seats where we had some retiring MPs. But we also picked up some really interesting new MPs, and I'm looking at, Edmonton, Griesbach with Blake Desjardins. And that's actually an interesting story for a couple of reasons. One, he himself has an incredibly interesting story. He will be the first two-spirited MP elected to Parliament. That will change conversations, certainly conversations around the Indigenous community and what has that meant throughout the course of this campaign. But it was also a bit of an interesting conversation for the Conservatives. That should have been a seat that they held. They didn't. And now the questions are going to have to get asked in Conservative land about whether or not there's a bit of a laziness of some MPs. What does that look like? And others that just work their tail feathers off. And, we see, the O'Toole folks picked up some seats in Atlantic Canada that I don't think people would have necessarily put on their board. So I think there's some shifts back and forth in the New Democrats in particular of where we picked up versus where we sort of may need to reshift some focus. I'm also just a bit heartbroken this morning. I was really hoping for the full comeback of Ruth Ellen Brasseur because she has actually changed politics so much. I mean, yes, there are lots of people who wanted her to be a cocktail party joke. She turned out to be an extraordinary parliamentarian and got reelected in 2015 because of her on-the-ground work, her work of learning French, her work of learning the community, really that grassroots advocacy. But how do you actually make an impact as those paper ballots that every party kind of runs? She made it work and made it where we had to pay attention to all sorts of ridings. I was really hopeful that we could get her back into the House, and we'll see when the final entrails. But the fact that she came back and was competitive still speaks volumes to the kinds of candidates that we were looking for across the country.
Well, thank you. Since nobody changed the result, really, give or take a seat here or a seat there, and again, we'll see if the mail-in ballots change any of those results, plus or minus 2 or 3 seats. Does this mean that for the upcoming Parliament that nobody has to change their game? Part of the reason why the election was announced was that Parliament was fractious, Parliament wasn't working, committees were getting taken over by the opposition. So as we look towards the next Parliament, what do we think the leaders should learn and the parties should learn from this election? And how should people behave in the next Parliament, given that the results from Canadians are much the same as 2019? Garry, I'm going to start with you and then we'll go to Andrew.
Yeah, I think this will be a longer term parliament than this current one. If you're the Liberals, a near-death experience in the early days of this campaign will certainly make the people around the Prime Minister and his team say, well, we don't want to do that anytime soon. We've got a win is a win, as Andrew said. Let's just take the win and continue governing. I think for the parties on the left, I think Jagmeet Singh had said that he would continue to support the Liberals in Parliament if they continue to govern. I think that Mr. Singh will probably try to exact a few more concessions from the Liberals, but I think for them it's steady as they go. The challenge for them though is that if there's not sharp points of differentiation between Liberals and New Democrats, it's a risk to the New Democrats in that, why vote for New Democrats when you can vote for governing Liberals? And so he's had to walk that tightrope all through his time. That will continue to be a thing. I think the Bloc will, continue its full-throated advocacy for Quebec. That was part of Blanchette's speech last night about delivering results for Quebec. And so we're going to, I think, see the same thing. I think the big question is for the Conservatives. There will be people who want to be more aggressive on Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. They'll want to pick up some of the issues that they were wanted to beat the Liberals over the head with, including documents, producing documents over this issue of the lab and Chinese influence. I think they'll probably pick up a lot of those same issues. The question will be for me, the Conservatives have also elected some new MPs, some interesting MPs like Melissa Landsman in Thornhill and Adam Chambers in Simcoe Grey and some of those Atlantic folks that Kim talked about. And if they have an influence on how the Conservative Party presents itself. Of course, the big question will be if the Conservative Party enters into some sort of leadership spill, then the party enters into some internal navel-gazing that until it sorts itself out, may not have that great of an impact on the day-to-day work of Parliament.
So just before I go to Andrew and then Kim, I'm just going to remind any of our listeners that you are free to ask questions in the Q&A function. So there's a Q&A function on Zoom, and we will be taking questions in a few minutes. So if you have any questions, you can start loading them in. We're keeping an eye on those questions, and we're going to attempt to get to as many of them as possible. So over to you, Steele. Andrew, what do you think? Do the Liberals need to change their game?
I think Garry covered off Parliament politics, the general thrust of the House. I'll speak more to government. I think I don't think it's that gauche anymore to use a disease analogy, but I think this government, the Liberals caught a really bad case of governmentitis, and I think because of COVID, they were in a position where you're trapped in your home, you're only talking to people who you work with, you're constantly talking about very minute government policy, using acronyms, you're avoiding saying anything incendiary, because federal politics is very much about not saying anything that's going to make anybody in any region or any particular interest group get upset. And that kind of mush-mouth thinking, I think, really became a problem for the Liberals. They were insulated, and I think a lot of people in politics, but especially for Liberals, because they were the government. They got more and more insulated from average Canadians, more and more inward-looking, more and more, expecting to be patted on the back a bit, I'll be honest. And the language, the assumptions, the connection to Canadians and their concerns, I think got a little separated. And that's a fixable problem, right? But it's a problem that I think the government had a little bit in its first mandate, but much more in its second mandate, because COVID, I think, reinforced it. But COVID also gave some of the solutions to that. I think one of the real innovations in the government is that the regional desks in most ministers' offices actually live in the regions, and they commute to work the way we're having this conference right now through Zoom. And so when your Atlantic Canadian outreach worker in your minister's office is living in rural PEI and talking to folks in rural PEI all day and going to the grocery store in rural PEI, they're not in that same 500 meters of the glebe that everybody in Ottawa seems to live in. And so you're not running into Bob Fife at the grocery store, you're running into a farmer who's concerned about, you know, dead livestock removal. And that's going to keep you a little more grounded. And so I think the more that they can do that kind of work of shifting staff, but also language and thinking and attitudes out of that hyper inward looking, jargon laden, internal government-y point of view, and much more into like thinking and acting and talking like Canadians, the better off they're going to be. Hire fewer people from Harvard and more people who've worked on a farm, in my opinion. So that would be a big change they need to make. And I think they had a terrible first 2 weeks because they had to shake off that government-itis. And when they did great. But if they can't shake that off, keep it shook off, they're going to have the same result next time. And so I think, or worse. And so if I was a senior person in this government, I'd be spending a lot of time in human resources and a lot of time on investing in people and a lot of time on hiring to change the attitudes and the mindset of folks away from talking frankly to people like me who talk in that jargony, crazy language, or at least can translate it, and more time rubbing elbows with people who wear overalls to work.
Kim, anything to add to the conversation in terms of how the NDP is going to approach this parliament? And to Andrew's point, holding the Liberals to account and reminding them of the everyday issues of Canadians?
Well, and I think you saw a lot of that in the last parliament and conversations between MPs to ministers, sometimes working around some of those staff, but really to say, how do we get, you know, the wage subsidy, let's be frank, wasn't working the way it was originally envisioned. So conversations behind the scenes between the New Democrats over to their friends in the Liberal Party to say, look, this is how we can do this. This is how it can be better for people. Those are the kinds of tangible things that I expect to see. It's what Jagmeet has talked about throughout the campaign. It's what our candidates have talked about. These are people who know how to move the conversation to a more practical approach. And I think the Prime Minister and anybody who's looking to be in that cabinet should look to getting out of the 100,000-foot super policy wonk land. And what does this mean for people? How do we actually help people? That credibility gap really plagued Justin Trudeau throughout the campaign of, you know, as Jagmeet liked to say, you say pretty words, but then you do X, Y, and Z. So they really do need to move away from that lofty policy wonky nerd land, which great, love it, but how are you practically moving on the environment? What are your targets? What's your implementation strategy? How are you getting daycare? You know, announcements are great, signing ribbon cuttings are wonderful, but people are looking for spaces. And, you know, there's probably some people on this call who've had the experience of, you know, we're about to have a kid. Maybe we should sign up for a space even before the child is born to try to get one. It's certainly the case for most of my friends that have had children. So, you know, those are the kinds of tangible things I'm expecting. And yeah, it's a tight balancing act in a minority government to push the government to do better and to do more, and where that plays out in the electoral system. But the cynicism that COVID has unleashed of people of, okay, all of our institutions actually do need a bit of an overhaul, between the ethics components, but just how people engage with government and see government. They should see it as a force for good. They don't see that. And that's the kind of thing that all the parties are actually really going to need to address in the coming months and years.
So Andrew, that's a good point that Kim made. How does the Liberal government help get over some of the voter cynicism and the anger that we saw during the campaign and bring the country together, especially given that the vote result is 32.2% of the popular vote? How do you bring the other 2/3 of the Canadian electorate that didn't vote for you on side, especially given what we know about the electoral politics and the pockets where Liberals get elected?
It's an interesting question. I think there's kind of three things I'd say about that. One is the most vitriolic angle we saw in the election. I don't think the Liberals are particularly interested in bringing on side, which is this kind of really anti-vax, anti-mask rage. And so I think there's an element of anger that's hard to manage, that is less, it's less, there's fewer people who participate in that anger, that particular brand of anger, but I think it is a real challenge in Canada, and it's something that's going to be a challenge for us to kind of disarm over the next few years. And I'm not sure if it's even possible. So I think I would put that into a category of specifics. Cynicism generally about the system. It's hard for any government to do that. I think oddly enough, COVID was actually quite successful in doing that, because it did remind people of the critical nature of government in an emergency. And I've had friends who are very cynical about government who are like, wow, that CERB thing seemed to work. Like the money actually came and I was able to pay the rent. And so there have been elements where we've seen government act quickly and well. And I think that it's really governing well that seems to be the antidote. And when public policy, especially broad public policy, is able to speak to people's actual needs, that's the antidote. The last part is kind of electoral. They don't need to bring on 100% of the vote, right? You don't need 100% of the vote. They need to find groups of people who are aligned with their values and speak to them and give them a compelling reason why they deserve their vote. And so I think there's some voters who are extremely angry, who are not particularly interested in. There's some, or at least it will be very difficult to bring them on side with the general Canadian project. I'll put it that way. The second thing is good governance is probably the best antidote to cynicism. And the third thing is, if I was thinking about the next election, bring on voting blocks, it'd be a different kind of exercise around getting out of thinking about it through provincial regional lenses and more about how do you speak to the suburban and exurban marginal voter that they seem to be eluding in getting to. Whether that person's in Montreal or Vancouver or Toronto or Ottawa's outer fringes, that's the voter they need, and they're not speaking to that voter. They're turning that voter off. So, or too many of those voters off. And so there needs to be a real project from the Liberals on how do you get to somebody who commutes to work in a car? How do you get to somebody who takes the kids to school in a car? And all the friends do, and speak to that voter. Is that somebody who cares about some of the Liberal issues, but also isn't hearing their day-to-day lives being reflected in the kind of rhetoric coming out of the party?
So Garry, it seems to me that Aaron O'Toole and the Conservatives have a two-pronged problem. The first is that they need to reach another 4.8% of voters in order to start to make some gains in terms of seats. 34% of the popular vote as of last count on the Elections Canada website, but governments are formed in the 38.5.
Yeah, the first point is it's not going to be easy. I'm just looking at some of the numbers and the regional breakdowns, 34-32 nationally, but in Ontario, 39 Liberal, 35 Conservative. So some people were predicting a much wider gap than that, over 10 points. It's certainly narrowed. The PPC did 5.5% in Ontario, and we can talk a little bit about that later because there are some ridings where that had an impact. But where Andrew was talking about before, whereas Conservatives are winning seats in certain suburban parts of the country, they're not winning them in Ontario. They're not winning them in those key seats around the GTA. They're not winning in Mississauga. They're not winning in Scarborough. They're not winning seats that they won in 2011. I think they have a net loss of one seat in the GTA altogether. And so people are still in Ontario are still finding the Conservative brand wanting. I think if they take a step back and they look, they're going to say, we thought we did everything to try to win these voters across. The problem was, in the midway of the campaign, when the issue around gun control came up, I think there were a lot of suburban voters that went, I'm still a little concerned about this Conservative Party, because in the early days of the campaign, the Liberals threw everything, the usual tactics that they do, whether it's talking about privatized healthcare or abortion or you name it, climate change or whatever. And for the first 2 weeks of the campaign, voters were saying, nope, I actually don't believe it this time. I actually think they could, Aaron O'Toole might have put that stuff behind him. But when it came to some of these other issues, I think you saw the numbers move very quickly, and it became, we find that he's, the Conservatives are still wanting on that. So he's going to want to, he made very clearly last night, wants to stay where he is in the center, big tent Conservative Party. There will be a number of caucus members, especially from Western Canada, who are saying, well, you said we lost in 2019. Let's try it my way. We tried it your way. It didn't work. We got to go back to basic principles, because that's where voters are. And I think, quite frankly, that's a huge mistake for them. But the temptation will be there, and the temptation will be very real. And if that's the case, Liberals will be saying, great, bring it on.
So I think just broader electoral trends. I see we have some questions in the Q&A, and encourage other people to continue writing their questions. We're going to get to them in one second. Given that 5 out of the last 7 elections have resulted in a minority parliament, do we think that minorities are here to stay, or do we think that we're just going through a weird time since 2004 in Canadian electoral politics? It seems to be disintegrating into more and more parties rather than consolidating around the 3 parties. Kim, I'll start with you, and then I think we'll just do a quick tour around the table on that question.
So there's a couple of different components, but I just want to pick up on the last conversation a little bit. Aaron O'Toole had a big credibility gap this campaign, and it wasn't necessarily him per se, but if you look at things like how their convention dealt with the issue of climate change, right? He couldn't bring his party along with them on that, are we going to do anything about climate change? Is it real? He couldn't manage that caucus component of that in the cabinet. Even on social conservative issues, he was saying, things that would appeal to suburban voters in a really meaningful way. But then Cheryl Gallant, who is the dean of his caucus now, comes out and does Cheryl Gallant type of things. So that disconnect between who Aaron O'Toole wanted to put out versus who some of the people who are elected around him really became a caucus management problem. You want to be prime minister, but what does your cabinet look like? We saw some of that also in the Ontario election last time. People looked at Doug Ford and went, not sure about you. So then he did the, Rod Phillips, the Carolyn Mulrooney, the Christine Elliott, here's my cabinet, here's my team. And people went, okay, whatever I feel about you, I respect these people. I think Aaron had a bit of a challenge with that. So I would say that, my free advice to Aaron O'Toole is figure out your caucus and figure out that problem before you start worrying about all the rest of it. But in terms of how we all go forward, and look, caucus management is a challenge for every leader, every party, but Aaron O'Toole definitely needs to do a better job of that before he starts, worrying about what the legislative calendar of Parliament looks like. Ultimately, what I'm looking for to see really is, what do these leaders want to do? What is their vision? What kind of parliament do they want to see? Who is it that they are trying to be, whether that's domestically here in Canada or even on the world stage? I know there's some questions in the chat around foreign policy. Canada's a G7 country, and I always say this, you're not just running to be Prime Minister of Canada, but of a G7 nation. What does that look like? What does our diplomatic reputation around the world looks like? That has huge impacts for business. That has huge impacts for the security of our country. And I'm not certain that those got enough of an attention, especially when the election was called the same day Kabul had fallen. So I think those are big issues that people are going to need to wrestle with collaboratively, frankly, within Parliament, but also even within their own parties. So I just wanted to toss that into the conversation mix.
That's fair. Actually, that's a good segue into one of the questions that we got in the Q&A about Trudeau and his foreign policy regarding China. So Andrew, I'm going to put that question to you. Do you think that the Trudeau government is going to change its foreign policy in any way with China or with the recent agreement that was formed with the US and Australia and the UK?
It's a good question. I'll be honest, I don't know. I think that and we can make this work and it's going to be great to real past skepticism, like real anxiety about China and everything from the canceling of the proposed purchase of companies to the way that Canada is using international relationships and trying to kind of build out how it communicates with other countries has started to become a real challenge because we're needing to really work our alliances at a time when we're becoming much more multipolar. And so I think that our policy has changed. I suspect that may even accelerate further. I know that when speaking with folks in Ottawa about anything that touches on China, it is always very serious and people are very concerned. And it is laden with multiple challenges, but a general sense of like anxiety. How do we handle this? We are concerned about this. We are sending tough signals that this is not good. And so a lot of the resolution of that, I think, is on the Chinese side, frankly, but we always say that, right? Like, so I think we also have to look to what Canada can do if we want to positively change that relationship. But I've been there twice. I'm very anxious about it as a country. I think that the geopolitics is rapidly changing, and that Canada as a middle power is going to have a challenging place in that changing multipolar environment. Gary's much better at this. Like he's the former.
Garry, you used to work for a former Minister of Foreign Affairs. So same question to you.
Yeah, on the China file, so much of it is tied up in the fate of the two Michaels. It's a very visual situation. People understand, the voters, Canadians understand the situation that those two gentlemen are in. And there's so much sympathy for them, and it's been I think a big wake up call for the Liberal government over the last, especially I'd say 2018 to now, about how to deal, how to think about, how to engage with China. Part of it also has been as a political issue where the Conservatives have really tried to use it as a very pointed political point of differentiation. Their platform this time had basically pages on a very aggressive China policy, very much used as a sword issue against the Liberals, and accusations that they have been weak and naive on China. To Andrew's point, I do think they have, obviously, it's a very different posture than it was in 2015, 2016 to where it is today. But so much of it is, if they could get the situation, the two Michaels resolved, that would take that off the table and allow them to focus on other aspects of the Canada-China relationship, which still have to be dealt with. So I think in some ways it'll be continued caution, continued, just being very careful on how they handle the file, while also making sure that, they defend themselves against conservative attacks, that they're soft on China. On the AUKUS deal, a lot of that is tied up in the submarine cancellation with France and the new submarine deal, which Canada isn't, playing in necessarily. But again, there will be people, and it's very concerning to see that Canada's participation in this was, hey, heads up, here's a phone call, we're going and doing this. And so it will be an indication of, does Canada's China policy in the past, amongst the Five Eyes relationship, having maybe a different, maybe a less aggressive attack on China, does that have an impact on our future relationships with the Australians, the UK, and the United States? And there, I think it remains to be seen. I don't think that's clear yet, but there will be people that make that case going forward. Canada considers itself sometimes to be part of the Anglosphere, our American, Australian, New Zealand, and British cousins. In this case, it feels a little bit being left out. I guess we're on the same thing with China, with New Zealand, sorry. And New Zealand itself has had its issues about its policy with China and accusations that it's been too soft on China. So we'll see how that plays out in the coming weeks and months.
Kim, anything to add before we go to the next question?
I think we can go to the next question. There's lots of time to talk about this and, you know, Huawei and all the rest of it. There'll be plenty of time in the days and weeks ahead for that.
So maybe I'll just add, it's interesting.
Go ahead.
It's not just China, right? So Canada's relationship with Mexico is much more fractious than it was 3 years ago. Canada's relationship with Brazil is much more fractious than it was a few years ago. So there's multiple different countries that are major trading partners of ours where we are having, you know, in Mexico, we're having assets seized. And so there is a much more difficult foreign policy environment for Canada to negotiate. And our traditional play of like, go see the Americans and they'll put some pressure on them is not working, not just with Trump, but with Biden. And so our relationship with Biden is not as good as it was with Obama and not as good as it was previously. It's a much more challenging global environment generally. China is a part of that, but it's not, even 2015, it is much more, the global environment's gotten much more difficult than it was in 2015.
Well, and even if you look at, you know, on the U.S. front, you know, border crossings, land crossings, how that's being managed, the whole discussion around Line 5, which has massive implications for Canada, and, you know, not just at the 100,000-foot public policy level, but on the ground of how people travel, how do people get around, how do, you know, I grew up outside of Windsor, so that those border communities who, frankly, the amount of nurses who go across the border to work in the US, these are massive issues that will be at play. And it hasn't been the warm and fuzzy kumbaya relationship in the geopolitics that we've seen in the past. The other part, you know, and really just a practical consideration on the geopolitics, we have the Olympics coming up in Beijing. Are we actually going to send our athletes? What kind of recommendations are we going to have? Anybody who was wondering what my mug is, it's a curling rock, and, you know, Canada is a powerhouse in curling, but maybe we don't send our athletes this time. And if we do, what are the warnings that we put around that? Those are going to be some of those practical, real life politic discussions that are going to happen about the geopolitical aspects of this.
Thank you. So I'm just going to combine two other questions we've got in the chat, and I'm a little bit conscious of time because we have a few questions going here. So a rapid fire round on what we make of the ministers who lost their seats last night. And for you, Garry, the question on the O'Toole campaign making this a referendum on Trudeau, was that a mistake? And did voters decide that the status quo was better? So ministerial losses last night, quick reaction to that, and then over to Garry. So I'll go to you first, Andrew, on the ministerial loss question.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think Jordan lost her seat over local politics. I think the Conservatives did a great job of identifying every bridge, abutment, and pier that needed to be rebuilt and hadn't been, and did a good job on that. I think Leboutier in Quebec was similar, like that Gaspésie Peninsula. It's oddly much more like Atlantic Canada, except everybody speaks French, so New Brunswick. And so similar, like a lot of local politics, a lot of local issues. Montef, though, I think was a combination of the Liberals were doing fine in the GTA. Peterborough's more like a Sudbury, a London, King's a bad example, it's a public sector town. But more like a London or a Sudbury than it is like Toronto. It's not GTA, it's its own city. And so the general declining Liberal fortunes outside of the GTA, I think, caught up Montef. Plus, I think it was accelerated by her comment about the Taliban, which I think just, caused a real challenge. So I think there's those factors.
And removed Peterborough as a bellwether for who forms the government. Garry, over to you for the question on was O'Toole's bet about making this a referendum on Trudeau a mistake?
I think originally it wasn't necessarily a referendum on Trudeau. Like the Conservatives came out very quickly out of the gate with their platform. It was very much focused on economic recovery. It was very much focused on affordability. So those things were all there. Of course, there's always a little bit of contrast with the leader. But I think as the campaign, especially in the first 2 weeks of the campaign, and you saw on the August long weekend, when I still had my feet up at the cottage, Trudeau had an 18-point lead on preferred prime minister over O'Toole and Singh. They were basically tied at that point. Fast forward to 3 or 4 weeks later, and O'Toole has a 3-point lead on Trudeau. So I think the campaign may have shifted midpoint and say, aha, there's a thread that we can pull here. Clearly people are, liking what we're selling. They might like, the contrast we have with Trudeau. And then, as the debates and as the gun issue came up, it shifted back again, right? So I think that will be a discussion point. I think they saw that there might have been a lever that they could pull to take the advantage, but it clearly didn't work in the end. And maybe when you say, this isn't your father's Conservative Party, when the messenger kind of looks like it's your father's Conservative Party, maybe that's a challenge for Conservatives going forward.
And perhaps you don't do that at the same time you're, wheeling out Brian Mulroney to go do your father's Conservative Party rally. With the other thing that's interesting, the local politics of Bernadette Jordan and certainly the national politics of the fishing boats that were being let ablaze. Those certainly had big implications. But all politics is local. And one of the things I'm actually quite intrigued by, especially going into minority government, is the amount of former municipal types who will be, who got elected. I look to somebody like Chad Collins in Hamilton, Stony Creek, longstanding Hamilton City Councillor, really one of those people who tries to actually bring people together. George, I've forgotten his last name, sorry, Cheval from Calgary, who got elected last night, also a municipal councillor. All of those things are actually what you kind of need during a minority government, is that pan-partisan look at the world. But look, the prime minister has to also look around at some of the women that they've lost out of this cabinet. People like Catherine McKenna, who chose not to run again, others who chose not to run again. He still has a big credibility problem with women in his cabinet and women in the country. This is not going to be helped by his new Spadina Fort York, quote unquote, independent MP. They need to do an overhaul of what happens on Parliament Hill for the safety and security of the people who work there. So it's a dual problem. But from a candidate perspective, there are some really interesting municipal folks who got elected. And look, I will always go back to Jack Layton was a hell of a good municipal councillor, and that's why he got so much done during minority governments. Those are the kinds of sensibilities you need as we get into this new parliament.
Go ahead, Garry.
I was just going to say, when you talk about breaking out, the elderly, it was, day one day it was the Liberals breaking out 100-year-old Hazel McCallion and 87-year-old John Chrétien. The next day it was Conservatives breaking out 80-something Brian Mulroney. I said, they're really going for the youth vote here.
And then Ed Broadbent made an appearance at an Ottawa Centre campaign stop. So look, everything old is new again, but those you can't really say it's not your daddy's party. The youth vote is also always heartbreaking. There's so many things that matter to young people. Taking polling stations off of campuses. Look, we can talk for days about the stuff that Elections Canada are going to have to be accountable for, some of the stuff they had flagged to Parliament before, but dropping polling stations down in Toronto Centre from 91 polling stations to 15 is just unconscionable in a democracy. The building that I live in has had a polling station since it was built, and they told us a week before Election Day that we were no longer going to have a polling station in this building. So those are some big challenges, and people are going to say it was the pandemic, but there's also been some systemic problems that Elections Canada hasn't really dealt with. And I know that's process and inside baseball, but when you're talking about democracy, process and inside baseball also really matters. You look, Keноra's had a problem in the fly-in communities for years. In 2015, it was flagged they didn't have enough ballots for all the people who were going to show up to vote. This year it was, oops, we don't really get around to doing your community on election day. all of those things need to be fundamentally overhauled. So, COVID covers notwithstanding, COVID has been covering a multitude of process sins, and I think that has to stop.
So this actually fits in nicely with another question we have in the Q&A. Based on the demographics of the voters for each party, where do you anticipate politics being within the next 10 to 15 years? And I'm going to squeeze my minority versus majority question back in there. Is this a preview to coming attractions with the People's Party on the right and other parties that ran on the right in certain regions of the country, like the Maverick Party, and then on the left, the progressive side, Liberals, NDP, whether or not the Greens can be resuscitated? There's a whole bunch of questions in there. We haven't even talked about Annamie Paul, but where do we see politics within 10 to 15 years? And should we get used to minority parliaments, because that seems to be what Canadians are choosing, especially in the last 5 out of 7 elections? Steele, I'll go with you first.
Yeah, it's a big question. So a few different thoughts. One is, I think the NDP has done very well with youth. I think they've done a great job, both in their technical marketing to younger people. I think their use of platforms has been really innovative and smart. And they're not relying on we're going on Facebook. They're using new platforms in new ways, and they're clearly employing digital natives to do that and doing, I think, a really good job. The challenge, and I don't want to sound dismissive, but the challenge is that the New Democrats seem to be doing a really good job of grabbing onto young people when they're young, the excitement of it. If you can get somebody to vote for you twice in a row, you usually can hold on to them for a long time. The challenge will be, as that cohort gets older, can you continue to speak to them in the same way while speaking to younger people in the same way? And I think if New Democrats can find a way to hold on to younger millennials and Gen Z, where they've done a really good job, that's a nice big chunk of demographics. There's not as many Gen Zs, but there's a lot of younger millennials. And so being able to hold on to and expand that group and follow their life issues as they get a little older, as they get closer into the housing market, as they get into being concerned about affordability issues, things like that, that's going to be really good for them to hold on to. So there's an opportunity there. And I think seems a really attractive guy. When I meet him, he's really personable and he's open and genuine. I think he's got a really nice persona. And so and the NDP does a great thing. They keep their leaders a long time. They find a decent leader, they keep them for a long time, and they invest in them. And they tend to keep, the study's a bit old, but they tend to keep their leaders 2.5 times longer than the Conservatives or Liberals. And so now, Liberals don't fire them as often because they tend to be prime ministers more often. But I mean, once the opposition leaders. So the issue, though, is will they be able to transition as they go? Second thought, on the People's Party, they got 1.5% of the vote in the last election. They were nowhere. They had a sitting member who finished a close second for the Conservative leadership, and it was a colossal failure. So, and they kind of ran as a more conservative party at a time when the Conservative Party was being accused of being conservative. So it didn't make any sense. They had an incoherent agenda at a time when people weren't really looking for that. This time they ran on, we're angry about masks and vaccinations. And that simple message that tapped into a small but potent group of people managed to get them somewhere between 5-6% of the vote, and much higher in some parts of the country. And so are they a permanent fixture in Canadian politics? No, they're an outlet for rage in a time when people are upset about things. They're I think the numbers that I saw from Advocates, they're kind of drawing 3 from the Conservatives, 1 from the Democrats, 1 from the Greens, 1 from the non-voters, and really not that much from the Liberals. They're an anti-establishment thing. The Liberals are the establishment right now. Are they going to last and become a huge force in Canadian politics for a generation? No. Are they going to be a thorn in Aaron O'Toole's side? Yes, because they're the reciprocal to the move to the center argument. And I think if I was his strategist, I would have run a move to the center kind of move as well. But holding that right flank for the Conservatives is a difficult thing to do. And the most stable period in Canadian politics in the last 25, 30 years was because there was a divided right. And Jean Chrétien was able to win 3 consecutive majority governments on the basis of vote splitting between the Conservatives, between the Reform Party and the PC Party. That's the nightmare for Conservatives. And I think the PPC represents that existential nightmare. And so their existence is less one of they'll be a big success, but they're going to have a big influence on the Conservative Party, and that's going to have a big influence on Canadian politics. And I'll just stop there. That's a lot of talk.
Gary?
Yeah, I don't know if they will have a big, long-standing influence of the Conservative Party. They will have an influence in how you deal with the People's Party. I took a look at there was 20 ridings where the CPC and PPC vote together would have beaten another member. But those ridings, of those, there's maybe 12 to 15 which would have actually resulted in possible vote turnovers, and it might have made it a closer, like 148, 133, 22 result, but still not enough to change, Conservatives into government going forward. Because there's some of these, to Andrew's point, there's a big chunk of these voters, maybe 50% are, angry right-wing Conservative voters, but there's a big chunk of these voters who are none of the above, angry at everything, don't traditionally vote. Somebody's listening to me. And the flip side to this too is Maxime Bernier himself. I mean, say what you want about Maxime Bernier, he doesn't usually have a trend of sticking with things. So, leading a ragtag bunch of people and being angry all the time may not be his cup of tea eventually. In terms of the voting coalitions, I do think that, voters tend to be more maybe loose fish. They're not necessarily sticking with one or the other option, which does create the opportunities for minority governments going forward. Where you might have that differentiation is, let's say a Liberal Party stays in power for 10 years and that momentum for change, that's where you get that rapid turnover into a majority government situation. But if it's a short-term election, 18 months is the last term, we like some of the things you've done, we're not crazy about the other things you've done, let's just keep doing what we're doing. That, especially if, 18 to 24 months after an election, that might continue to be the trend. If it's a longer minority, it may change, but there's my 2 cents.
I just want to make a point before I can, and I apologize for interjecting, but I think what Gary's speaking to a little bit is what I think of as the dominant force in Canadian politics, which is the Tory Syndrome, which was described by George Perlin back in the early 80s. And it's that the Conservatives boom and bust. They have a period of they're winning, they're doing really well, like Mulroney, Diefenbaker, Harper in 11, they get a majority and they're in, and especially Mulroney and Diefenbaker, classic examples of this. They win big because the Liberals have gotten terrible and arrogant and everyone wants to punish them. But then there are coalition fractures between, rural Conservatives from Alberta and, Francophone nationalists from the rurals of Montreal, or the area around Montreal, and the whole thing falls apart, and they spectacularly fall apart. And then they kind of fight themselves in this war of shibboleths and, what are we standing for and who are we, true Conservatives? Are we going to move to the center? And that goes on, and they can't keep a leader long enough to actually build up any public profile. And they get into what he calls the Tory Syndrome, which is this kind of death spiral of, the caucus undermining the leader, and the leader can't get a win. And so then the caucus is fueled to undermine him some more. And then they get a new person, they undermine that, him or her, and just kind of goes on and on and on like a merry-go-round, until frankly, the Liberals become so horrifyingly arrogant that they have to be thrown from office. And so that tends to be the cycle in Canadian politics. And I think what we've just seen is yet another round of this. And the PPC's rise, in my opinion, is fuel for that Tory syndrome. It's going to be every rural Alberta MP who wants to take out centrist Aaron O'Toole and go back to losing on things that are principled is going to get their wish. And that's going to be the fuel that helps them do that. So sorry, Kim, I just want to make that point.
I'm just, before I let Kim get in, I'm just going to try and squeeze in another question, Kim, that I think is in your wheelhouse especially, and feel free to finish off this debate, but I just want to get another question in there because we are getting short on time. The question is, what impact will this federal election have on the sequencing of fixed election schedules of 21 and 22 for municipal and provincial elections, especially in Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario? And then the supplementary to that question is, will this help get housing into cities for 1.4 million newcomers? So I know that there's a lot to that question and the debate that we just had, but I'm just trying to get in these last couple of questions before we're going to part company here today.
Look, I can talk about housing for days. In fact, one of my favorite coffee mugs, because clearly I have a coffee mug collection, is it says NIMBY tears and the not in my backyard syndrome. That is what has blocked housing in this country, certainly in the city of Toronto. But even as people leave Toronto to go to other municipalities, it's the NIMBY syndrome is becoming more and more prevalent. That's going to require some leadership by cities to stop haggling over red tape for days and weeks and months and years and decades in some cases, and actually get on with it. I look at the city of Hamilton. They just released some survey results that said 90% of Hamiltonians don't want any urban boundary expansion. That's great, but did you tell them that means you got one of two choices? You build up or you build out. That's it. Or you have thousands of people who are on the verge of homelessness or hidden homelessness. So that is the crux of what is facing us in this housing crisis. There is a lack of leadership at all three levels of government that has not unlocked the ability to build affordable housing, true affordable housing, because that is very expensive in most real estate markets. But also the log jam that, frankly, the wink, wink, nudge, nudge used to be, they'll just sort it out at the OMB, the Ontario Municipal Board. We don't have that luxury anymore. And now it actually requires people in municipal government in particular, but all three levels, that they need to actually create an efficient way to move forward that also requires them to go up against what I call the pitchfork mafia of NIMBYs. If you think about that Simpsons meme with all the townspeople coming out with their pitchforks, that is what every housing development in the city has become. It is ridiculous, the fact that in East York, the parking lot is the hub of the community. That kind of NIMBY language, when you're really just trying to house people who have had a tough time, that to me remains a challenge, as does our thought process around mental health and addiction and surrounding services. People want to say, I want to help these people, but does it have to be in my backyard? That to me is where we need to move forward. So I want to talk about housing affordability, but this also requires a real honest conversation about what is actually at the root of this, and open up and unlock those lands. What I saw in this election campaign was every party talking about unlocking some federal lands, moving things processed faster. I know that there are lots of people who complain about ministerial zoning orders. Not a big fan of them. I think you can find a collaborative solution. But the reason that they are so popular is because these projects get caught up in red tape after red tape and battles that are just completely unnecessary. Sorry, I'll get off my high horse and just say, for those who are wondering why we have a housing shortage and a housing crisis and a housing affordability, that is fundamentally the challenge with it. And that requires the political will to move away from it.
So just thanks for that, Kim, on housing, such an important issue that was covered by all the major campaigns. In terms of electoral sequencing, Trudeau said during the campaign that we're going to be back at it in 18 months. Your leader said, not really. We probably wouldn't have been in this election in the first place because I would have supported. So what's your best guess as to how long this government lasts and how it might interfere with provincial and municipal elections?
The first question will boil down to, and I think, Andrew, you kind of made this point, how humble the Prime Minister actually is by this. He doesn't have the keys to the house completely, right? He doesn't have carte blanche. Canadians have said the last two campaigns, figure out your political sandbox, figure this out because that's what we've elected you to do. And while I don't always like how voters vote, they are never wrong. And they've done that again in this parliament to say, go figure this out and stop finger pointing.
It's time for lunch. Remember
Sorry.
to wash your hands.
I have a good reminder system, but when does that fall? Who knows? Does it impact municipal elections or provincial elections? Absolutely not. In Alberta and Edmonton, you saw yesterday was the close nominations for candidates. So campaigns continue on, which is fun for us to pontificate about. And they will have impacts on candidates and candidate selections. But we still in Ontario have an election on June 2nd. We have municipal elections in October of next year. That does not change based on whatever's happening with the federal government.
So it is time for lunch, and we do have one question that I just want to get to. Andrew, can you just give us a 30-second answer to the question on the scandals? Do the scandals, are they front and center for Trudeau, or did this election enable voters and the government to move on? The We Charity scandal and the military were both brought up in the question. And I know 30 seconds is probably not enough to answer that question, but we are short of time.
So as a politician moves forward, scandals are kind of like weights that get attached to them, right? And so the first one doesn't do much. The second one is a little, the third one, the fourth one, and the sixth one, the ninth one. And eventually, there's a lot of weight, and it's hard for the politician to keep moving forward. And I think that the challenge with scandals, they're inevitable. They are, they usually speak to your Achilles heel. Trudeau's had a couple humdingers. The SNC one was particularly exciting. So they just build up over time. And at some point, politicians, either are kind of transformed, and there's a transformational moment, and they're able to kind of overcome those. Trudeau, the father, kind of had one of those in '80, where the opposition leader, like Clark, just kind of made a mistake, and he was able to turn into a referendum on Clark and win the election and get another majority. But then again, the scandal just built up again, or it just becomes too much. And so I think for him, it's additional weight. It's hard to keep moving. Trudeau, and I think we saw this in the campaign, is a man. He is intense, and that intensity is driven by adversity. And so I think as he, I don't mean this to be polishing anybody's apple, but I think he's the kind of personality that as things get harder, he pulls harder. And so I think he's a bit of a person where the scandals, the weight, he can carry a lot of weight, I'll be perfectly honest. And I think that it's something where he's driven to continue to move forward. I'm interested in that. And I think that some politicians, they hit their point, they're like, I'm not moving forward anymore, I'm done. And others just pull it. And he strikes me as a guy who likes to just keep pulling. So that metaphor.
Or it fits in well, Andrew, with your drip analysis from before on conservatives duking it out until the voters can't stand the government that they have, and then they call the question. I said at the very beginning when we met before that we would have no problem whatsoever in speaking about politics for an hour, and that is absolutely correct. I just want to thank you all for joining us here today. I want to thank you. Say thank you to the participants. I think we had a good showing of people tuning in to get the analysis from the panel today. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us. And this panel has been recorded, so if you would like a copy of it, I think we can send that to you. But thank you for joining us here today, and good luck as the 44th Parliament gets underway. Good luck to all of you and your teams, and we look forward to the next conversation that we're going to have. Thank you everyone for joining us.